Okay, hi everyone. I know there's still a big line and people are trickling in, but we want to make the most of the time we have today. So, if we could start quieting down, I'll introduce Mark and then hopefully we'll get started. Um, but thank you everyone so much for coming. This is our last biomes of the semester. I'm happy to be here bookending this semester series. Please come back, same time, same location in the spring. I think we're gonna have a really exciting lineup of speakers as well. And thank you all for your continued participation. Um, so it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Mark Ashton, the Morris K. Jesup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology, the Director of Yale Forests, and the Senior Associate Dean for the Forest School. Mark has conducted over 35 years of research on the biological and physical processes governing the dynamics of natural forests and on the creation of their agroforestry analogs. Mark's work spans disturbance ecology, regeneration dynamics, tropical and temperate silviculture, and the design of sustainable forest and agroforestry systems. In addition to Mark's research, he is also the overseer of Yale's 11,000 acres of teaching and research forests and has helped shape field-based education for generations of students. He has collaborated on projects across the Americas, Asia, and the tropics. He has contributed to global conservation practice and long-term forest management planning. Today, Mark will be presenting the first 100 years, a history of Yale and forestry and its contributions to environmental conservation worldwide. His talk traces the development of Yale's forestry program, its impact on global conservation science and practice, and the institutional legacy that continues to shape forest stewardship today. So everyone, please help me in welcoming Professor Mark Ashton.
Okay, yeah. Oh, it works. That's great. You might want to turn me down a bit, though. One thing you should know is I'm not an environmental historian. The second is I'm really long-winded, and we have 100 years. I bet we don't cover that. We'll cover something. Uh, and yeah, the third is yes, it's sort of my perspective. There are lots of other folks who know a lot more than me about the history of Yale, the forests, Yale forestry, um, the environmental history of the whole school. So I don't know exactly why I was picked, but I'm here. Okay, so first 100 years. Let's just go through a little bit about what I'm going to try and struggle to get through, and talk a little about the sort of why forestry and why the profession, sort of a period that North America went through in terms of extensive degradation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about restoration. That's a word we hear a lot about in the tropics today, but actually, North America went through that same process, and that was the impetus for why this school was created. So we'll talk a little about the period of restoration, then a little period about industry, particularly post-World War II, and then a little bit about the uh, era of transition from industry to environmental services, the environmental movement, and how the school got wrapped up in this. And then from 85 to 2000 and beyond, the area of sort of diversification of areas, of interests, um, and what this school is today. So, beginnings. Well, the first thing you should know is everything you look outside your window, going up I-91, going along I-95, it was all agricultural land once upon a time. The settlers, mostly in this region, subsistence poor settlers, deforested much of southern New England. Only 25% of the forest remained, and that 25% was heavily logged. It was a woodlot. It served sort of the products of subsistence farming. Much of eastern North America faced that. And by the 1800s, there was an extensive period of deforestation when it actually became a commercial product. The sheep, merino sheep, imported from Spain for wool that really precipitated an accelerated rate of deforestation. And then the collapse of the wool industry in about 1850 is one of the reasons why forests came back, because most of the marginal land could not sustain any kind of commercial agriculture if you hadn't got the wool industry. And it was at the same time as the Civil War. So people were essentially, particularly young men, were drafted to fight, particularly in the North, to fight the South. So there's a depopulation of the rural environment, both in terms of the Civil War and, of course, the Northeast, right here in New Haven, was the center of the Industrial Revolution. New jobs, relatively stable, not the nicest of jobs, but better than working on really rural subsistence, poor land. So people depopulated. So that was one reason why, at that time, there was a lot of concern about the situation in terms of forests on the eastern seaboard of North America. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was fueling the deforestation as a wave right across the other side of the Appalachians, into Pennsylvania, into New York, into upstate Michigan, all the way to the West Coast. So much of the other lands that were formerly forest were cut over, not necessarily completely cleared for agriculture, but cut over to fuel, over a period of just 50 years, the Industrial Revolution. The federal government, after the Civil War, essentially precipitated a lot of this. It gave large land grants to railroads. It gave small grants to settlers. It facilitated the disposition of indigenous lands, and there was very little regulation. So by the late 1800s, there was a lot of concern about the human value that forests sustain. Forests sustain the drinking water, they sustain, in a sustainable way, the timber supply that essentially created the Industrial Revolution. And there were people here at Yale, way before the school started, like William Henry Brewer of Yale University, who was the chair of one of the very first scientific schools in the nation. The Yale Scientific School, it became known as the Sheffield Scientific School. It was housed at the top of the hill. It is no longer, but it was one of the first, started in the 1840s and then essentially closed in the 1950s. But this is, if you think about the 1800s, you think about science was just beginning. Ecology, Ernst Haeckel, a German, coined it in the 1860s as a disciplinary area. Darwin was thinking about evolution. So science was coming of age in the 1800s at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. And so these science schools, newfound science schools, were starting. William Brewer, took an interest in agriculture at the Sheffield Science School. And he essentially was also seconded by the US government to essentially do the first census of woodlands and forest systems in the United States as a part of the statistical atlas of the ninth census, 1874. So there was an emerging theme here in terms of Brewer here at Yale being concerned, and he became an advocate for the conservation of forests, or essentially the degradation of forests, the denudation of forest lands. He advocated for the Forest Management Act of 1897 that supported the actual protection of certain forests, particularly in the West, by the federal government. And he recognized that all forests, public and private, needed management. So that's the first, that lays the sort of the setting. By the way, the Sheffield Science School offered the first PhD in the nation, 1861. So yeah, it was on the cutting edge, but it wasn't the core mission of the Sheffield Science School. The core mission was science. Agriculture was a part of it. In fact, the first big agricultural science school was actually the Michigan. It is in the Michigan Agricultural School, became Michigan State. And you will see that's actually a lot of the faculty, or some of the faculty from Michigan State, first in agricultural teaching at the undergraduate level, came here to teach in the first forest school. But then there was also Gifford Pinchot. So Gifford Pinchot came from a relatively wealthy New York, Pennsylvania family based on development, deforestation. I think there was a little bit of a guilt complex with James and Mary Pinchot when they suggested to young Gifford, wow, how about thinking about forestry as a profession? I hear in Europe there's something going on there, scientific forestry. Lots of people, Brewer, the Pinchots, recognized that there could be a timber famine, water, drinking water. So when Gifford entered Yale College in 1885, he also read George Perkins Marsh's Man and Nature, a classic at that time. He took Brewer's course in preservation, culture, and use of forests at the Sheffield Science School. This all allowed him to essentially ruminate about, wow, you know, forests are in dire need. And so he was advised to learn about forestry by going abroad to Europe and to work and to be mentored by someone called Sir Dietrich Brandis, who was actually, he started the Indian Forest Service in 1850, colonial forest service under the British government. So that's probably one of the oldest forest services in the world, in Dehradun, in the Himalayas. He started it and for about 20 years mentored and taught the profession of forestry. He was a German. So when Gifford came back, he came to actually the young Oxford Forestry School in the UK, where Dietrich was there, mentoring future colonial foresters, and mentored Pinchot, and then advised him to go to the school in Nancy, the French school, and then take a field trip to the Swiss Alps with him, Dietrich Brandis, and then also to essentially get mentored by German and Swiss foresters. So when Pinchot did that after graduation, he came back to Brandis and said, well, what do I do? He said, well, go manage some land. Go back to North America and manage some land. And so he went to essentially the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina and tried to demonstrate sustainable management there. He eventually took on, after Furnau, a German forester who settled in the United States, who was also, he became the director of Cornell's first forestry school, which actually occurred before Yale's. He replaced Furnau as the sort of chief of the division of forestry. It was a part of the US Department of Agriculture at the time in 1898. But he was very powerful. The Pinchot family, wealthy, well-connected, much more so than Furnau, friendly with Teddy Roosevelt, and so could persuade Roosevelt to essentially convert the division of forestry into something much more politically powerful. First into a bureau in 1900, into 1900, and then quickly into the U.S. Forest Service in 1905. And it was he who essentially changed a lot of those essentially forests that had been just set aside to become part, millions of acres, of the U.S. Forest Service. He resigned in 1910 over a squabble with Taft, primarily because Pinchot was very much an advocate for acquiring new federal lands, protecting it from an enormous amount of logging and unsustainable use settlement from landowners or speculators who had no real interest in trying to sustainably manage it. So that's Pinchot. He later became the governor for a long period of time, successful governor for Pennsylvania. So I'm setting the story here, early beginnings, scientific forestry. The last part of the story is really, when you're thinking about it, is Nathaniel C. Marsh Hall. That was his home. He wasn't actually very wealthy, but he had a very wealthy uncle. We all like very wealthy uncles, but not all of us have them. But George Peabody, as in the Peabody Museum, not just the Peabody Museum here at Yale, but there's a lot of Peabody museums. He's actually from Massachusetts. But Nathaniel Marsh was actually paid for by Peabody. His salary came from Peabody to be a professor here at Yale. That's a pretty odd situation. Yale wouldn't pay for him, at least not to begin with. He was the first professor of paleontology in the nation. And he actually also did an enormous amount of work in the West, but also in the East. He actually discovered, originally there's about 11 fossils. He ramped it up to 123 species of fossil in the matter of his sort of period of study. He was very well known, as was someone called Edward Cope, a rival from the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences. They actually essentially were friends, and then they became rivals, squabbling over bones. But when you think about Marsh, he also contributed a lot to the evolutionary backing of Darwin's theory. He was one of the first sort of professors in paleontology that really provided the evidence for how birds evolved from dinosaurs. That was one of his large sort of discoveries. In order to do that, a lot of his work was in the Dakotas. And so he befriended and became sort of collegial with the Lakota Sioux, and in particular, the head of the Lakota Sioux, Red Cloud. And of course, as you know, Native Americans are not, or were not, being well treated by the US government. Red Cloud would come to Marsh Hall, set up his tent in the middle of the rotunda, and he would stay there and he would essentially converse with Nathaniel Marsh about how to work with the US government before he went off to DC to essentially negotiate on the part of his tribe his reservation, what size, what deal he could make with the US government. So this was actually, well, you can probably recognize Marsh's building. I'm sure that was probably built by Peabody. And then you can also see Red Cloud with Marsh in a fairly staged photograph, but most of everything is staged in those days. So that would become the Forest School. So now let's talk about some of the faculty that started this Forest School. And the first one is someone called Henry Solon Graves. He was the first dean from 1900 to 1910, and then the third dean from 1920, actually 1922 to 1938. He was a great buddy of Pinchot's, but a younger person. He graduated later from Yale College. He studied after Yale College, I think under the influence of Pinchot, to think about forestry. He went off to C.S. Sargent. C.S. Sargent was the first director of the Arnold Arboretum. The Arnold Arboretum is the biggest living collection in the Western Hemisphere of tree species, temperate tree species, large collections from Asia, temperate Asia, Europe, and North America, part of Harvard University. A very famous arboretum. And so he learned about trees from C.S. Sargent. He then went to Germany, traveled Germany. He went to the University of Munich. He was mentored by people like Brandes, people like Hardig, people like Meyer, all well-known scientific forestry professors at the University of Munich who taught sort of the early thoughts of reforestation. Central Europe was going through, actually much earlier, these same problems of degradation. And so how to plant, how to reforest. So when he came back and he was asked to become, being a Yale grad, and also both Pinchot and Graves had a very strong, if you think about Yale College, humanities backgrounds, social science backgrounds. They weren't really taught sort of the science in any big way. When they came back, they introduced a forest school that was really built off of the sort of an aspect that you could characterize Yale for in terms of Yale College, sort of the humanities, understanding people and human behavior rather than the science. When Graves Pinchot founded or funded the program with a small endowment, it was approved. They hired or they recruited 7 students in Marsh Hall. That was the original school. And then they had the president, Arthur Hadley, introduce the students. And there was just really, apart from Hadley, Graves, there was someone called James W. Toomey, who I'll talk a lot about. He was essentially the exact complement to Graves. He was a scientist. Pinchot, the founder of the school, and Brewer, who was very keen to see this forest school start, being the chair of agriculture in the Sheffield Science School. So Graves was a very, very formative individual in setting the nature of how the Yale Forest School and how the School of the Environment is today. He was the first dean. He was the second dean. He actually was a provost for Yale. That's highly unusual for a little school called the Forest School or the School of Forestry to actually have a provost for Yale University. I think it's the only one apart from, maybe the only one. He was awarded an honorary degree for all his work, law degree in 1940 after his retirement. So that's one person to think about. And they created a school that is the oldest graduate professional program. And that gave us a huge leg up, a graduate program rather than undergraduate. Cornell was an undergraduate. The State University of New York was an undergraduate. Cornell folded. It's one of 2 private institutions that really teach forestry and now, of course, environment in all its sort of diversity. Because of Graves's interest, students come from different backgrounds. Well, there was no actual forestry background for a student to come into. So that was one reason. They had a variety of experiences. And because it's a graduate program, the individuals that they recruited had a certain sense of maturity, a sense of self-development. That sounds a little bit like you guys? Maybe? On occasion? Some of the original requirements were quite stringent. A high standing, students were admitted without examination if they had requisite knowledge of some of those sciences. Otherwise, they had to take entrance exams. They had to take entrance exams in English, political economy, the sciences, but most importantly, everyone had to take an entrance exam into modern languages, either German and or French. And that's because most of the literature, in the sense of the science, particularly around forests, was in German or French. So here are some of the early graduates. And I've got to catch up with my notes here. Hold on a minute. So, class of 1904. I have got I've got my little circles on. You can see my circles here, and does it work? Sort of, yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to just talk a little about some of the graduates, okay? So the first that you can think about here is, this is the 1904 class. I've skipped. I could go to any kind of class. We could talk about people. But the first is Oh, there we go. Oh my God, I'm just getting it. So this is someone called Greeley, William Greeley. He was the third chief of the US Forest Service, and so we'll talk a little about him later. But he was very formative, as in there's a building named after him here. There's also, right from the beginning, international students. A good proportion. In fact, about 20% of the student body was international during the early days, and they remain that way. So we have, excuse me, I got to get my name straight. Yeah, so we have, on the bottom, we have Gennaro Lagdamio. He was one of the first of many Filipino foresters. If you remember at that time, the Philippines was a part of a colonial state of the US. So many of the Filipino foresters were trained here to manage the forests in the Philippines. So that was Gennaro. And then we also have someone from Japan. And there's actually other foresters up there you can see who are international, but this fellow here. And that is Yukichi Hogadachi of Japan. And if you think about Japan, Japan was going through a lot of the same kinds of processes that North America was going through. Japan has being an indigenous population, a much more ancient understanding of how forests were managed, but they were interested in converting or merging their traditional knowledge with the idea of science and the idea of scientific forestry that this school was sort of trying to essentially develop. And so he played a very formative role in merging that kind of information in Japan. Who else do we have? There's some other really important people here. You will see this person here is H. Chapman, Herman Haupt Chapman. We'll talk about him later. And this is someone called Hawley, both future faculty at the school. Class of 2009, you can think about, well, Leopold, Aldo Leopold. When you think about Leopold, he was a founder of the Wilderness Society. He was a founder of the Wildlife Society. Later, in the 1930s, he went to work for a long period of time after graduation. Most of these American men that you see here went to work for the newly founded Forest Service. That was their only source, primarily source of employment. Sometimes some of the state forests that were developing at the same time. But there was no real opportunity to work in industry, or there was no such thing as an NGO or the conservation movement that would come later. Other people you can think about. The other thing about Leopold is he advocated actually very early on for wilderness. The Gila Wilderness was actually created in 1921 by William Greeley, the person I just showed you, who will become the future forest. So 500,000 acres. And it was way before the Wilderness Society actually started. The other thing that you can think about is that tropical forestry really started right from the beginning with individuals from the Philippines, individuals from Puerto Rico, individuals, as you'll see, from Africa, from Indonesia, from southern China, all essentially coming to learn about this newfound thing called scientific forestry. Other individuals that you can see there, this is the graduates of 1923. Ooh, I've got to get the whole. This is George Garrett, who will also become a future dean. And George Garrett was a professor who really studied sort of preservatives and wood products. And you'll see that the school went through a very, very important history, particularly during the industry period of its phase in wood products and forest industry. He was the dean in the 1940s. You will also see two gentlemen, one here on this side. This is Amos F.A. Amos, he became chief of the Philippine Forest Service. And then you will see we had a lot of Chinese graduates. This is, oh, I've got to get the name right here. If I only had simpler notes. Oh, Chun Wan, who became a leading expert in the taxonomy of conifers and a professor at Nanjing in China. So you can see right from the get-go, the school played not just a formative impact on America's western forests, particularly, and state forests nationally, but also internationally. And that's the reason why it had a real formative stage on western forests, was because of this. In 1905, there were 60 forest reserves covering 63 million acres. 5 years later, when it became the Forest Service, 1905, when it was in 1905, when it became the Forest Service, it was automatically transitioned into 150 national forests and 145 million acres. And it was the job of, at that time it was Pinchot and these new hires from this school, to essentially enforce grazing permits, to essentially inhibit mining, illegal logging. And they basically got a pretty nasty name from a lot of the political elites in the West and the landowners in the West as the Tsar Pinchot and the Cossack Rangers, for essentially battling a lot of these kinds of landowners. They also battled them, maybe for the right reasons. You can see how this is the big burn that you're looking at, but a lot of the slash from logging became fuel. It's very, very susceptible to very large fires. And that's essentially what happened in 1910. Wildfires raged across the northern Rockies. There was it was called the Big Burn, a burn that essentially went through 3 million acres, mining towns. There were over hundreds of people who died. And it became a very, very sort of big lightning rod for what to do with the Forest Service, the land. It was a very sort of tentative time about how to essentially control fire, control illegal logging, control the various kinds of impacts that were going on these federal lands now, that many politicians, many landowners were eyeing. And it was a great excuse to say, well, look, you can't even control fire. And so it was partly because of that, and the sort of the disagreement that Pinchot had with Taft. Pinchot resigned, and Graves, the then dean at the Forest School, took over. And Graves was the chief of the Forest Service for a good 10 years. And it was he, followed by Greeley, followed by Stewart, all past graduates of the school, followed by Silcox, who were both embroiled in the big blow-up and then essentially politically astute, essentially said, well, we have to have more men, we have to have more equipment, we have to have more money to fight fire. And so there was, right from that sort of stage of trying to solidify the justification for having a Forest Service, they solidified it through protection of fire. That could be, obviously in the long run, to their detriment, because they essentially thought all fire was bad. It was a very European construct in that respect, which fire is not very common in Europe, or is thought of as bad. But in North America and Western North America, if you know about the ecology, much of fire is good. It's a question of how, when, and where. And they basically stamped out what many of the employees of the Forest Service were doing, and many landowners were doing, which is called light burning, or a derogatory term, Paiute burning, burning that Indians, Native Americans used to do all the time. So, yes, for 3 decades, the Forest Service really stamped out fire through a very heavy-handed perspective, trying to essentially solidify their own political sort of happenstance. Okay, so what was going back in New Haven? Well, fun and games, perhaps. This is the first camp. This is at Pinchot's camp. It started in 1904 in Milford, Pennsylvania. It's still there at Great House. That's Pinchot's old residence. It's now part of the U.S. Forest Service. It's a part of a history. It's where it was fairly broadly open to both the incoming students, but anybody who wanted to learn a little bit about forestry. So there were women, men, and essentially learning about sort of just the beginnings of camp life and the natural history of forests, surveying. It became more restrictive when the entrance requirements and the student body became more exclusive to, there were too many students, essentially became much more restrictive. They named their camp lines Broadway and Fifth Avenue. It is essentially the beginnings of what you all went through in terms of mods. And it continues not here, but in various other ways, all the way through the trajectory of the development of the school. The other thing you should recognize is that the New Haven Water Company is the oldest sustainably managed water company in the nation for drinking water. It's 26,000 acres. Some of you in the urban mod know all about that. You saw some of the oldest dams. It still is, the teaching and research laboratory for the students, because it's just right next door. You could go by tram from here to the forest. And it still remains that way, but it was the main teaching and research laboratory for a period of time before the school really sort of engaged in research on its own forests. So this is the original faculty. And this is a picture from 1924. There's a couple missing. There's James W. Toomey, and this is the relatively white-haired gentleman. He's the elder statesman you could think of, compared to Henry Graves. This is H.H. Chapman. This is 1924. Remember, he was a graduate in 1904. And you can think this person here is Ralph Hawley, also a graduate of 1904. This is Samuel Record, a graduate a little later. And then Ralph Bryant, who was actually a graduate of the Cornell School. And all of them taught different subject areas. All of them produced textbooks, the first textbooks in the nation, around their particular subject areas. If you think about 1924, there had been a few changes. I'm going to go back and forth, a few changes that had gone on. You can see by 1921, the school had changed its name from the Forest School to the Yale School of Forestry. It had actually solidified its identity, in other words, around the profession. It managed to obtain money to build Sage Hall in 1923. And that became the major teaching residential hall in terms of the faculty offices. And then Bowers was built a little later in 1931. And Bowers was essentially built by someone who, Bowers was essentially a lawyer who graduated from the Yale Law School in 1861, who worked for the federal government around law for a long period of time, trespass law, environmental law, or what would be considered environmental law at that time, and came back and taught for a period of 17 years law to the students, and then bequeathed a certain amount of money. Gosh, these lawyers must be rich. And that was allowed the school to build Bowers. It's named after him. But he was our first environmental lawyer. Okay, so let's just go through some of these faculty, and maybe I will get to the end of that, and that'll be the end of it, right? We'll see how far I get. So was, still it's very much the restoration area. James W. Toomey, he came, as I mentioned, he was a graduate from Michigan State, the first agricultural school in the nation. He became a professor, actually assistant and then full professor at the University of Arizona, became the director of the Agricultural Experiment Station in the University of Arizona. Anybody who went to the University of Arizona would know James W. Toomey. There are trees named after him. For those of you from Arizona or New Mexico, you'd know about Quercus toomei. He was a very, very good botanist, a very, very good ecologist. When Graves left to become chief of the Forest Service, he took over as dean. He was a founding member of the Ecological Society of America. He also brought, a contrast to the humanities and the policy and the law that Yale was already strong in. He brought the science, the strength of botany, the strength of ecology to the school. And he brought a strength of maturity and a strength of teaching to the school. He was really the only mature teacher when you think about the other faculty that came on board later. This is James W. Toomey with his English sheepdog. This is him in his field with his students. You'll see E.J. Neathling in a prior photograph that I didn't highlight, was a very, very strong collaborator of some of the plots that Toomey set up at the Yale Toomey Forest. It wasn't called the Yale Toomey Forest then, it was called the Keene Forest. It was bequeathed to Yale by one of its first graduates, George Hewitt Myers, MF of 01. But it was Toomey's forest. It's where he did all his work. There's some really interesting phenomena. It's a very much a second growth forest. It came in on old fields. It was a pine forest because it was in the Ashalot River Valley, very sandy soils. It was also really important, and still is, Native American forest. It has the oldest archaeological site in New England, the Whipple site, when that landscape was tundra, right after glaciation. It also has an ancient fishing village that was essentially a fishing village with a fish weir in the Ashalot River that is still there today. So there is a huge ancient land use history to that forest, as well as a modern history. We can talk about modern history in terms of 100 years of Toomey's work, Toomey's first experimental work as a scientist, as an ecologist at the Yale Toomey Forest. His ashes, his wife, Nanny Trowbridge, as in a relatively famous New Haven name, Colleen will recognize, and his sheepdog are all buried there in terms of their ashes. There's a little memorial if you ever want to go. I always get out a little glass of malt whiskey with the students, and we take a toast to Toomey when we go up there. But to be honest, he did some really formative work. He was one of the first ecologists, first botanists to do experimental work. If you think about ecology at that time, it was all observational. Toomey did them at Yale, at the Toomey Forest. He trenched. He was really trying to understand what is more important, light or soil moisture for the growth and the release and the sort of competitive dynamics of understory vegetation in a forest. Those experiments were replicated worldwide. When I go to Sri Lanka or I go to India, and you go to the old forest plots that colonial foresters, Sri Lankan Forest Department, the Indian Forest Service had in the Western Ghats or in the monsoonal forests, they did those same things. They repeated those same experiments because they were so formative, trying to understand, if you're trying to understand sustainability and understand how to obtain natural regeneration, how can you facilitate it? Is water the competing agent or is light? He wrote the first forest ecology textbook in the nation. It's called The Foundations of Silviculture upon an Ecological Basis. It's a very formative textbook. And it later became, the pedigree became Spur and Barnes, and then Barnes at the University of Michigan. And his early work was all about planting. He wrote all about how to essentially propagate, to plant. That was reforestation. That's what the nation needed, particularly in the eastern seaboard. The other person who did a lot of work at Toomey was, gosh, you know, I've only gone 45. I should probably wrap up. But you're just going to look at the restoration era, and I'm not even going to finish the restoration era. Well, this is, I apologize. But I did tell you I wouldn't finish. I didn't think I'd get, never mind. I didn't think I'd get, I thought I'd get out of the restoration era. So here's Ralph Hawley. He did a lot of white pine. Fisher, who was the first graduate of the school, one of the first graduates, he also started the Harvard Forest and the Harvard Forestry School, which essentially finished after the World War, before World War II. But they did a lot of pine silviculture, and essentially Hawley wrote the first textbook in the nation on silviculture, the first edition in 1921. This is interesting, right? This is Yale camp. This is now getting into the 1930s, and you're looking at the Bowen Forest was bequeathed in 1922 from the death of Bowen, a graduate in 1917, went off to fight in World War I and died as a fighter pilot in those dogfights. His family essentially bequeathed 468 acres to Bowen, now called the Bowen Forest in Mount Holly, Vermont. It's a protected area. But the third forest was, again, George Hewitt Myers, who bequeathed a much larger tract of land, close to 8,000 acres, that is now the Yale Myers Forest. And the Yale Myers Forest, believe it or not, the faculty did not want the Yale Myers Forest. We do now, but it was considered a huge white elephant. Well, if you think about it, it was all cut over. If you're a Mainer, it would be called puckerbrush. You couldn't make any money. What were you doing? You're just sitting there and paying taxes. It was a drain on income. And of course, if you think about Yale and the school at that time, it was all funded off of tuition, small grants. It was a fairly small, light operation, very sort of tenuous operation. But this is essentially, I guess, the faculty visiting Yale Myers, and you can see some members of the faculty. That's James W. Toomey there. That's Henry Graves. Enjoying, I guess, a day in June before acquiring Yale Myers. Anyway, I'm going to try and see what we're going to go off to here. I'm going to probably stop after this story here, because this is a kind of a nice story, and then we can take questions about sort of the first 30, 40 years rather than the first 100 years. Ralph Bryant and H.H. Chapman. I mentioned them. Chapman had a nickname by the students who was very popular, named Chappie. They essentially moved from the camp at Milford and essentially went south. And it's really because if you think about the first wave of deforestation was going on, and the Forest Service was essentially acquiring lands out west, the other sort of frontier was essentially the south. Heavily cut over. All those longleaf pine stands were essentially being cut out from beneath by essentially logging companies. There were very, very few companies that essentially sought any kind of help. And when someone called Henry Hartner essentially asked Ralph Bryant to come and see if they could essentially develop a sustainable way of managing southern pine, Bryant leapt at the chance to bring his students, H.H. Chapman, and they stayed there for at least 20 years, working essentially in Urania, looking at ways of sustaining longleaf pine and particularly some of the southern hardwood swamp forest systems. And so you'll see that was a very innovative, that was the only sort of logging company, and there were still no jobs for foresters in the South at that time, because essentially a forester was there to impede that sort of process. And there were no companies willing to essentially or gainfully employ foresters to essentially control the kind of the rates of cut to create a more sustainable way of managing. So most of the forest graduates are still going west or working for the state, not for private industry. It was only after the war that the school played a much bigger role in the industrial South than prior to the war. When I say the war, I mean World War II. But you can see some really formative papers here by Chapman and Bryan around fire, around sustainability, and the use of fire. H.H. Chapman, completely opposite to his students who were regulating and protecting all fire in the West, is considered the father of controlled burning for silvicultural purposes in the southern United States. He introduced fire primarily because it was longleaf pine. So I am going to stop there. Yeah, I got to, 1930s. I'm sure my dean is not going to be very happy with me. But anyway, maybe to be continued. There's a lot to talk about, but I knew I wouldn't get through this. But it gives you a sort of a rich history.
We have time for one question, and there's also going to be a coffee chat at 1:30. If anyone would like to continue the conversation with Mark in the Sage Lounge. Any questions in the room? Oh.
Mark, it's Gordon over here. Jumping just a few years ahead, could you talk about Dave M. Smith and probably his most famous graduate student, who is you?
No. To be continued. You have to jump 50 years ahead. Yeah, no, I understand, but do you want to see how much I have before David Smith? This is the biggest tropical wood collection in the nation. Did you know we had that in the world? Harold Lutz, the first ecosystem ecologist in the nation. And the first person to really understand ecosystem ecology in the sense of people, and wrote the first textbook in soils. He basically became, if you know Herb Borman, I'm at Harvard Brook, which is equivalent to David Smith of that vintage. There is a legacy of each of these faculty building upon their name. So Lutz begat Borman, Borman begat Raymond. Chris Vogt in between. Yeah. Anyway, so there is a trilogy. Crossett, Arkansas, incredible place. It's where the school had an actual camp to really practice and demonstrate sustainable forestry in the South, and where at that time in the 1940s to 1965, when it essentially finished and stopped, it essentially served to employ and create a whole bunch of graduates who then became employed in the U.S. timber industry in the South. They transformed the U.S. South from something which was being cut over to something which became sustainable. And still our wood basket is the U.S. South. It's a very, very important economic driver of North America's economy. Yeah, then Dean Garrett, Concert Hertz, Greeley. Did you know that Greeley was essentially designed as a forest? And it was a wood technology lab, and it was funded entirely by forest industry. I should stop.
Thank you.